Hi there, and welcome to a new series of short videos to use Nina. This series is looking at the Target Scheduler plugin, which is something that's been developed over the last year. If I bring up Nina and look at the plugins page, I've already installed it and it appears as Target Scheduler at the bottom here. The plugin page shows some description and links to documentation, and it also has some options at the top of the screen. It was developed by Tom Palmer, and myself, Matt, Linda and another Chris have worked on improving it through trying it out in our own systems and working together to try and suggest easier ways to enter in information and use it. This is still in beta form. It's not perfect, it still has a few nuances to improve upon, and we're still working on rigorous testing with things like roll-off roofs for safety protocols. But so far it's been performing admirably in a number of observatories around the world. The best way of describing what the Target Scheduler does is to look at a more conventional sequence and how it can be replaced by the Target Scheduler. If I open the Sequencer tab and pull in a sequence that I've prepared earlier, this particular sequence has multiple targets. But before we go into that, let's just take a look at the general structure. So I have a startup part, I have a shutdown part, and then I have three targets, some of the Messiers. Now, the Target Scheduler can be used for a single target or multiple targets, and the essence of it is to manage the exposures. So if we looked at one of these targets, what we would typically do is organise them so they started and stopped at a time that was suitable according to their altitude and availability in the season, and also whether they had completed their runs or not. And of course each target has a different profile, so you have to manually work out which targets happen when. If we look into the target itself, apart from the target information, you have to do things like check whether it's below the horizon or not before imaging it, and you need to loop until it starts getting light again. And before even taking pictures, you have to send to the target, and you have to slew to the declination and RA and so forth. And there's things like autofocus and guiding, all to be managed. Other things to be managed are things like meridian flips, autofocus triggers and so on. When we actually get to the core of this sequence, I have in my standard templates three exposure sets. One is for hydrogen sulfur oxygen or narrowband, and again each filter has its own unique time and gain setting. I also, when I'm doing narrowband, always take natural colour star images as well. So again, RG and B filters here with shorter times and a different gain setting for maximum dynamic range. Both the narrowband and the RGB for stars have a moon angle setting, which stops them getting wiped out by illumination from moon. And if this Messier was a standard galaxy or cluster, I wouldn't be doing either of these, and I would simply delete them, and I'd be looking at a standard LRGB sequence. So again, this has got LRGB filters with times and so forth. It's interesting also to note that this has got dither management here. So for instance, in the case of a narrowband image, if I just remove the LRGB sequence, I now have narrowband, which takes two images of each filter, followed by star exposures, which again takes two exposures for each filter, and then dither management that simply does a dither. So what happens here is you get 2H, 2S, 2O, 2R, 2G, 2B, then a dither, and then it repeats. And in that way, each individual filter gets a dither every two exposures, but you only dither once every 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 exposures, which is very efficient. What I've largely described here is replaced by one of the two new instructions available from the Target Scheduler plugin. So if I just come back up to here and remove that there, I can simply delete these three and then take this new instruction called Target Scheduler Container and drag it here, and it will do the same job. This single unassuming instruction replaces mostly the three separate exposures for my different targets, and it can do one or multiple targets, and it runs in real time to work out what the best target is to take at any particular point in time, and it manages how many exposures have been taken, it does the centering, and it does all the exposure plans and so on. And it only needs a few instructions around it to make it into a working sequence. At the moment it looks blank, and it will look blank until you start running it. When you run this sequence, that's when it will get populated with target information. The targets themselves and the exposure plans and how you decide what is done when is put into the plugin page. And it's now time to look at the plugins in more detail. If we take a look at the Target Scheduler, under these three unassuming options, we have the ability to create a complete exposure plan and against different targets. We also can see what the likely outcome is for any particular day, and scrolling down further we can also see what has been completed so far, along with a kind of grading score. But let's ignore these two for the moment. Let's just look at the essentials of getting one of these special sequences to run. If we take a look at the target management section, there is a box labelled projects and there's a box labelled exposure templates. In both cases there's the word profiles, and if I click on that, what it does is it shows me the available equipment profiles that I have presently in Nina. And if I look at the options and general, you'll see I only have one profile at the moment. If I were to take this one and duplicate it, then if I go back into the plugins page and then do refresh, I now have a new profile. A key point here is that the exposure plans and the templates and the target plans are specific to an equipment profile. And while you can copy them between profiles, when you generate the Target Scheduler to run, it's specific to an equipment profile. The other thing to note is that these two boxes in effect update and manage a database that runs in the background. And the editor for this is a little unusual in so much that when you want to change something, you have to specifically say you want to edit it. So for instance, if I click on this Pegasus GT294 project, to edit it, I have to actually ask it something. So for instance, if I click on here, I can't edit any of these fields until I just press this little pencil button, which puts it into edit mode. And that's true of the exposure templates, the target list, and also the project settings. I'm going to cancel that just now and just want to point out some of the other icons along the top here. So you have edit, you have copy, you have delete, you've got save, you've got cancel, which I've just used, and you can also add another target to this particular project. You can also paste a target or import mosaic panels from the Framing Assistant or a target from the Framing Assistant. Let's just take an overview of what we have in these two boxes, and then we can understand how this is all put together. The way to start the scheduler programming is to get an exposure template in and then create a project into which you add multiple targets which then link to your exposures. If I take a look at the exposure templates box, I have the two profiles for my different equipment setups, and if I click on the first one, you can see that I've already created a number of exposures. So I have LRGB, which is my standard colour exposures for something like a galaxy or cluster. I have my narrowband exposures, and I have narrowband RGB exposures, which are much shorter ones, just to record star colour. And if you remember, that mimics everything that I had in the sequence I pulled up earlier. You can see that it lists a summary of their settings. So for instance, you can see I've got the filter name, the exposure time, the offset and the gain, and so forth. I also have some other interesting things. I can set what level of light pollution to cope with. So this is starting with civil, because I'm in the middle of summer and that's okay for a cluster, and also whether I'm trying to avoid the moon. In each case, I can edit what I've already done by hitting the edit button, and I can change things around. So for instance, if I just cancel that at the moment and look at my narrowband exposures, the default exposure is a bit short at 60 seconds, so I can make that 300 seconds and then save that and then go on to the other one. So that's also 60 for some bizarre reason. Sulfur and save it, and similarly for oxygen. You can also create completely new ones for a particular purpose, say for instance exoplanet hunting. So if I just quickly edit this whilst I remember, you can also see that I'm setting individual settings for how it's managed. So for instance, not only gain and offset but also binning, the reader mode of the camera, which is something that's appearing more frequently with CMOS cameras, and also things like acceptable twilight. So for instance, if I just save this and move on to this one, twilight for LRGB is probably not a good idea. So if I go into edit mode, I might want to make that nautical and then save it. And similarly with these ones. Lastly, the moon avoidance, whilst it's an on-off, also has the same controls as the standard plugin, which is the separation in degrees and the avoidance width in days. So you can set different moon avoidance criteria for each of your narrowband or wideband exposures, just as I did in the complex sequence I showed earlier. If I want to add a new exposure template, there are a number of ways of doing it. I can, for instance, just come out of that, click on here, I can duplicate any of these, and I can also just simply create a new one by hitting plus. So for instance, if I leave this one alone and go into this one, I can simply add a simple exposure template, give it a name, in edit mode first, it will catch you out as it just has done me. Test 1, and that's good. It defaults to the default camera and gain setting unless I change it. The reader mode again is default. If I save that and now look at it, I can now copy that and then paste it, and I can now call this test 2. Okay, and change a different filter, say, save it, and now if I go back to here, I've now got 2 exposure templates which I can use against a number of different targets. And I can continue to add further exposure templates for different filters and scenarios, for instance narrowband exposures or stars simply to capture star colour. If I go back to my original exposure template on my live profile, again if you go under options, this is the live one here with a little tick next to it. I've obviously put in all of my exposure templates that I require. Where the gain isn't populated or the offset isn't populated, that's because it's using the camera default for that particular exposure template. If I now look at my projects, this is where we bring these together and a set of targets to create our plan. Again, I've done one before, and if I look at this Messier marathon for the narrowband images, you can see here are my settings for the actual project, but if I expand it out, you'll see here are my different targets, and I'm just going to show you how those are created and how they bring in the different exposure templates. The important thing is that each project can have its own settings. So for instance, if I click on one of these are the project settings. So you can see that it's an active project. There is a minimum exposure time. There's a minimum altitude. I'm not using a custom horizon. I have a meridian window set for 4 hours, so it prioritizes targets which are in the meridian area. I also can change the filter and dither frequency. So for instance, if I'm doing RGB, it'll take 2 filter exposures before moving on to the next, and then it'll dither after every 6 exposures. And also I can enable or disable an image grader that does some basic measures of goodness. And importantly, at the bottom here are what they call the scoring engine. So this basically sets what target will be imaged when. So it can prioritize things that are almost complete or just a general project priority. It can also try to dissuade it switching between too many different targets too quickly, or it can prioritize things that set the soonest, and also whether it's in the meridian window. Onto the individual targets. These are something that we can create by a number of different methods, and I'm going to simply create a target for my duplicate project just so that I can show you how it's done. So I'm going to create a project for my newly created equipment profile, and that project is going to be created with the little plus button, and I'm going to put it into edit mode and type in the name. So the project is going to be the Virgo Messiers. I'm going to create it as an active project. I'm going to have minimum target time of 30 minutes, minimum altitude of 35 degrees. I'm going to image around the meridian over a period of 2 hours, which is 120 minutes, and I'm going to take 2 pictures with each filter before moving on to the next, and dither after every 6 exposures. And I'm going to leave the scoring engine rules for the planner as their defaults and enable the image grader. So I can now save that, and to this project I now need to add some targets. If you click on the project name and then click on the little plus button, it allows you to add several targets. So for instance, there are a number of ways of doing this. You can either bring them in from the Nina catalogue, or you can bring it in from the framing assistant, or you can bring it in from a previously saved target or target within a sequence, or indeed from a planetarium that's been connected. If I type in one of the names of the Messiers, for instance M88, and then click on it, it automatically populates its coordinates. But interestingly, if I go into the framing assistant, M80 is here, and what I can now do is just very slightly alter my framing if I wanted to. I can now go back to the plugin and click on that, and if you look carefully, the coordinates will slightly change to represent the slightly altered framing. Once I'm happy with that, and I've got the right angle for the project, which can also come in from the framing assistant if necessary, I'm going to save it. And I'm going to do exactly the same with some more. Before I get carried away, I want to first start adding some exposure plans to my different targets, because this will enable me to do a shorthand way of creating like exposure plans for multiple targets. If I click on my first one and go into edit mode, I can now see a little plus sign under exposure plans, and it'll automatically bring up the first of my exposure templates that are stored down here, and I can select which one I want to do, and I can also, for instance, say how many exposures of each do I want. And what I can also do is change, if necessary, what the exposure time is. So there's a default that's already in the template, but I, for instance, can override that, and I could say 300 seconds in this case. Now, there is a small bug at the moment, because although I selected test 2, that hasn't worked, but as soon as I save that, it now flips over to test 2. That'll be fixed in a future revision. And individual exposures I can remove here, and I can add as many as I like. So for instance, for my narrowband objects, I'd have 6, I'd have H, S, O, and then star R, star G, and star B. And what I now can do to save time for the future is I can duplicate this entire target along with this exposure plan, which saves me all the effort of adding the exposure plans to each target in turn. So for instance, if I now hit this button here, it creates a duplicate. Go back to here and then paste it. It creates a duplicate of M88 along with its exposure plan, and now it's a simple case of going in there and changing the target. So I can either change it in manually, or again I can import it by, for instance, typing in another Messier, maybe M86, and then I can save it. So now I've created very quickly a target along with an exposure plan that's the same as an exposure plan for one of the other targets. I'm going to leave it there for the moment, and I'm going to just simply quickly add an exposure for that one, and quickly add an exposure for that one. It doesn't really matter for the purposes of this demonstration. So now each of my targets has got an exposure plan. There's one other generic setting panel we need to take a look at, and we've already looked at the project settings, but also there's the profile settings, and that set of preferences is brought up with this button here. And these concern themselves with regard to how the telescope is managed in between targets that don't follow one upon another, and also in regard to how the image is graded, and if grading is rejecting an awful lot of images, how much further it goes before it just says enough's enough. So now what we need to do is take this project and make a sequence with it. If we consider this Virgo project with 4 targets in it, a traditional sequence would look like this. So you have the startup and the shutdown, and you have your 4 targets, and within each of the 4 targets you have all the complicated exposure instructions and triggers. We don't need any of this, and we can actually remove these very quickly and replace it with a simple sequence instruction set, and in the instruction drop the target scheduler. The reason we put it into a sequential instruction set is traditionally we put the triggers for things like autofocus and for meridian flips in an outer loop, and the target scheduler manages things particular to a target. So for instance, we may wish to add things like meridian flip, which is down there, and autofocus after temperature change, and loop conditions we do not need because this manages all the loop conditions. And in the instructions themselves within the target scheduler container, you'll notice it also has an area for triggers and a number of special case instructions which can be of use to us. So for instance, under triggers, the one that I typically would use is center after drift, because only the scheduler knows what target is being used and therefore what its coordinates should be. These little ones here can also be useful if 2 targets don't follow on immediately one from the other. There's a wait period, and it sometimes is useful to park the scope in between the wait condition. So before the wait starts, we may wish to park the scope, and after the weight ends we might want to unpark the scope, just down there. And if you had a system where you had a roll-off roof or something, that also means that if you had some bad conditions during the wait, that the roof can shut very quickly. But we'll look at safety conditions in far more details later on. And this basically is it. This will run. If you have a system on a tripod in your backyard, this will run and it will automatically queue up these 4 targets that were put in the project, and it will work out which ones to do when, and when one's complete it will move on to the others using the criteria that was set up in the project. The other nice thing is I made some mistakes when I set up the exposure templates, and I do not now need to change this at all. I can just leave this as it is and save it. So I'm going to save it as test targets, and I can use this night after night without modifying it, and it will simply pick up the database with all the target information and how much it's progressed and whether they're good ones or bad ones, and it'll just carry on. But the nice thing is, if I do need to update something, I can go back into the plugins page, I can look at my exposure profiles, and for instance in a couple of these I think I set the acceptable twilight to the wrong one. So on these two, what I want to do is I want to set that to nautical, and save that, and save that to nautical too. I think earlier in the video I had some civil ones which are clearly a mistake, and I need to change those also to nautical. And the nice thing is this automatically updates itself through the system, so the project is refreshed automatically and it'll take that into consideration as to when it starts an exposure. There is one small gotcha, however. If I run this sequence, nothing will happen. And the reason for that is if I look at my options and look at the active profile, my active profile is Pegasus GT294. But on the plugins page, the project I'm running belongs to a different equipment profile, which is Pegasus GT294 copy, and therefore it will be inactive. So for this to run, I need to make sure on the options page that this is now the profile that I'm running, and then it'll actually take some pictures. I've got to wait for some clear skies to actually show you what it looks like in practice, which may take a little while, and we're going to take a look at the other options on the plugins page with regard to the scheduler preview and looking at acquired images and further enhancements to the sequence to add more intelligence to it. Thanks for watching, and I'll now start working on the second video.